Andalusia, 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 Andalusia. يا نصر أجدادي يا نصر أجدادي عودي بأمجادي عودي بأمجادي يا نصر أجدادي يا نصر أجدادي عودي بأمجادي 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 عودي بأمجادي.
رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is really beautiful being, alhamdulillah, in this masjid for my first time in this great community, and I ask Allah preserve and bless all of you for taking time out to come today. So our topic of discussion today, I think, is a very important one, to discuss about the history of Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus, Spain, in fact, is the largest country in the entirety of Europe. And so if you think of it like this, therefore, that Muslims had a very long-lasting civilization in Al-Andalus in Spain. Their presence was for about 700 to 800 years in the largest country in Europe. We had Khilafah system of Islam running civilization in the largest country in Europe, and we happen to be in Europe. And so therefore, if you think about the context of the whole thing, it looks quite interesting for us. Why did the Muslims have an interest to go to Europe, to Spain, to Al-Andalus? What was so interesting about this space, Al-Andalus, that made it different to what they were used to in what you might call today the Middle East or the Arab world? In the year 711, a man called Musa ibn Nusayr, who was the governor of Africa, took a young boy, quite young man, called Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was around 19-20 years old, and he was a freed slave, and he made him the general of his army and also appointed him as governor of Tangiers. Tangiers is the northwest, the furthest northwest of what you might call modern day Morocco, Al-Maghrib. And Musa ibn Nusayr and Tariq ibn Ziyad, these two important people, was sent. This was part of the Umayyad Khilafah, decision making, to go to Al-Andalus. In all honesty, we don't know exactly the reason why they went there. One thing that Muslim historians write about quite after the event is a popularized story. In this story, you have a person called Julian. Julian is the Count of Quetta. Quetta is the northeast, the furthest northeast of Maghrib, Morocco is Quetta, furthest northwest is the Tangiers. And Tariq bin Ziyad, of course, is the governor of of Tangiers. And so, what happened, the story goes, that the Count of Quetta, Julian, had a problem with the king of Spain, of Al-Andalus, Spain, called Roderick. And the alleged story goes that the Count Julian of Quetta had a daughter, and the daughter was sent to Spain to study in one of the schools of King Roderick. And when she was there, she was abused. She was abused, mistreated in a bad way. And so out of his sense of vengeance or revenge, he wanted to exact against King Roderick of Spain. He allied with the Muslims, or he assisted the Muslims in arriving into Al-Andalus. This is a very popular story. She herself is popularized as Savaromia. She's named Savaromia. Some Christians have a negative attitude towards her. They see her as like a seductress, a very loose woman. Others, they see her as a victim. Depends which history you're reading. In any case, she figures prominently in that early episode of the arrival of the Muslims. And so in the year 711, Tariq bin Ziyad takes an army He has about 500 infantry, 500 cavalry, and they cross the Straits of Gibraltar and they arrive into Al-Andalus. Gibraltar, you might know, is named after him. It's Jabal al-Tariq, the Mount of Tariq, which they named Gibraltar, named after him. And so when he arrives, what does he see? What does he see in this new land of Spain? Why are they there? That big army is there. Who's there in Spain? Spain is ruled by the Visigothic people. The Visigothic people are a Gothic tribe, like you have the Ostrogoths and you have the Visigoths. And they were ruling Spain. They were Christians. They were newly converted Catholics. Just before they became Catholics, not too far in the history, they were in fact Arians. It's the weather. Alhamdulillah. Arians. So who knows about Arians and Arianism? In the 4th century, you had a Christian priest called Arius. Arius was a priest, and he was present in the Council of Nicaea. Maybe you might know about the Council of Nicaea. It's where the Christians debated about the personality, the personage, the nature of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. And so he was one of the priests who was there, who argued against the doctrine of the Trinity that Catholics believe today. The one upholding that doctrine was a man called Athanasius, priest, and Arius was his rival. He argued against him. He believed in fact that Isa alayhi salam was not Allah, was not God, was not a son of a God in a divine sense of the word. And so he was not accepted, he was sent into exile. And so the Spaniards, the Spanish Christians were Arians. They followed him. Until before the Muslims arrived, they converted to Catholicism. And so if you think therefore, that means in their history, in their bloodline, or so to speak, their parents, grandparents were Arians. That's much closer to Islam than Catholicism is. Belief in the Trinity, and so on and so forth. And so when the Muslims arrived, these Visigoths, too many of them embraced Islam, accepted Islam, because they saw the similarity between Arianism and Islam. They connected to Islam. Others who didn't, they accepted Muslim rule. And others who didn't accept Muslim rule nor became Muslim, they fled northwards. And this was mostly the Visigothic nobility, the rulers of the land. They didn't accept Muslim rule, nor did they become Muslim. They just fled. They fled north, as far north as they could go. The main one, his name was Pelagio, and he was a leader of these rebels who fled north. And when they fled north, they arrived right to the top of Al-Andalus, a place called Asturias. Two places, Asturias and Galicia. And these are mountains. And so the Muslims, therefore, when they're sending the armies, different districts, Sija and Seville and Granada, Cordoba, all these places, some are accepting, like Toledo falls quite quickly to the Muslims. Cordoba, there was a long siege, they didn't accept very easily. But they didn't go as far as these Visigothic nobility went, right to the top of Asturias and Galicia. They did send some, they sent some people there. But the point was that the Muslims had a very strong cavalry, very strong horsemen. And the horsemen struggled to go all the way up to the mountains. And this is why they thought, well, it's only a few of them, let them die out by themselves. They can't cause them much damage because we're now ruling the country and we shouldn't trouble ourselves too much. But it was a mistake. And it was a mistake the historians write about in hindsight after the event, because this initial small band of Christians in the Asturias and Galician mountains would grow. They would grow in size, grow in power. Early on, you had a very famous battle in the year 712 called Battle of Covadonga. And so the Muslims, they had different military rulers. The first one was a man called Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani. And one of the early ones, I think even the one before him, he sent a small force to fight these Christians in the north. When they went there, there was a surprise attack. So the king, they appointed him king. By the way, they appointed him. They had a network, they had leadership. They allied with other Christians who also fled north, didn't accept Muslim rule, and they became kind of a small power unto themselves. They refused to pay taxes, so no paying the jizya. They were kind of independent, autonomous, small, independent, autonomous rule. And so when the Muslims sent this small, contingent to try and engage with them, there was a surprise attack. So they thought that they had left, but they didn't. They came around them. It's a bit like Battle of Uhud, if you think. They came around them, and they took their spoils, and then they defeated them, and they killed the Muslim ruler also. Now Christians, they depict this Battle of Covadonga as a spark of the Inquisition. They see this as the spark. It was like the seed that was planted in that year, 712. And then hundreds and hundreds of years later, you would have the final expulsion of the Muslims in the Inquisition, and that was the spark. They depict it as the first victory of Christianity against Islam in that land. Okay, but in any case, the Muslims, they say it was more like a skirmish. They say it was more like a skirmish. And later on, there was more battles, and they were defeated as well. But the point is, as a presence, they remained in the mountains of Asturias. Now, Muslims, they consolidated power and rule when they first arrived into Al-Andalus. Who else was there? So, who was the Christians? There were also Jews. There were Jews living in Spain. How were they treated? They were treated very badly. Very badly. I always see, in fact, as a kind of an irony of time, kind of circumstantial or situational irony, that some of the many similar things that happened to the Muslims in Al-Andalus much later on had already happened to the Jews before the Muslims even arrived into Al-Andalus. It sounds like quite an interesting irony. It's quite true. So before the Muslims arrived, what was happening with the Jews? The Jews were persecuted. The Jews were forced to become Catholics. The Jews were forced to be baptized. The Jews, they had Council of Cordoba, for example. Visigothic rulers like Ricard I, Chinthilla, had edicts against the Jews. They would say, like, the Jewish children cannot stay with their parents because they would deviate them, so they have to stay with Catholic, foster parents. And so all of these prescriptions against the Jews because of, of control and injustice. And so when the Muslims arrived, they saw this minority of the Jews, and they gave them rights. They gave them rights. The Jews were expelled out of Al-Andalus. The Muslims brought them back inside into Al-Andalus. The Jews were not allowed to have synagogues. The Muslims were allowed to rebuild their synagogues. And the Muslims made a very famous treaty called the Treaty of Theodomir around that time. So by the way, when Tariq bin Ziyad came in, the next year, 712, July, Musa ibn Nusayr met him with a big contingent of 7,000 people as an army. So they came together, these two, the next year. And so the Jews therefore had a very tough time, but when the Muslims came, it was a really great happiness for them. This is why you have Jewish historians like Zion Zohar says that when the Muslims crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, the Jews welcomed them as liberators from Christian rule. They saw them as saviors, liberators, that they've come to liberate us, and it's quite true, it happened like that, Allahu Akbar. They gave them the justice of Islam, and not to mistreat people or treat people as second-class, third-class citizens. They gave them a sense of presence, And so, now in the Treaty of Theodomir that they made with, this is now with the Visigoths, the Catholics, with Theodomir, they had rules, so in the treaty, it was modeled, by the way, on the treaty of Umar ibn Khattab that he made with the Christians of Beit al-Maqdis. Not to destroy churches was one of them. Not to break crucifixes was another one of them. Not to disrupt them on their national holidays, like on Easter or Christmas time, was one of them. And it was really welcomed by the Christians, because they thought, well, that's actually a great deal for us. They could worship in their own ways, in their own places. But of course, under the rule of Islam, the Jews had their rights, and really it seemed quite a good deal for people. Except, of course, for the Christians of the north. But of course, in time, those Christians would grow. And they would grow, and they would grow. Now, a few very important things happened in this time. This is 8th century. So 712. Now we come to the 720s. In the year 721, the Muslim ruler, or you could say the leader of the army, as well as being the ruler, was a man called Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani. And Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani, he took his army, and they went to Toulouse, in France. Okay, so they've taken Spain. Now they're pushing further north into France. They get to Toulouse, and in Toulouse they meet an army fighting under Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Okay, again France. So they're loyal to him. They're not his army, but they're loyal to him, fighting under him, and they have a victory. They defeated the army of Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Samh Malik al-Khawlani is celebrated as this great, fighter, general. But Duke Odo of Aquitaine was present in the battle, but then he vanished. He just went away under secrecy, and they thought he had left. He had not left. He had gone to receive help from a man called Charles Martel. And Charles Martel was like they call him the Prince of the Franks. Charles Martellus, the Prince of the Franks, of the French. But he wasn't interested. So Odo of Aquitaine is telling him that the Muslims are just coming because they've taken the whole of Spain, and they're coming north. They're going to take France also. They're trying to make him feel. He wasn't interested because he thought they're not that powerful. They can't do that, because remember that France was the Christian base. The Pope lived in France. The church was very strong in France, and so not interested. And so Duke Odo then returns, and when he returns, surprise attack against Samh ibn Malik al-Khawlani, and he's martyred there. He's killed there, and he's martyred there. And so that's 721. Now we get to 730. In 730, the new Muslim, governor called Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi, rahimahullah, he takes his army, and they go to Aquitaine itself. So the power base of Duke Odo of Aquitaine, he went straight there to Aquitaine itself. And when he gets there, again, there's a defeat of Duke Odo. Duke Odo is not there. They go as far as Bordeaux. This is France. This is like they're going further north, and there's a victory. Now Duke Odo, what does he do? He goes back to the same person that he told him not interested. Goes back to Charles Martel, and he says, "Look, you told me that they're not strong enough, but they've just defeated us all over again in my power base of Aquitaine, so please send us help, reinforcements, do something." So Charles Martel, now he listens carefully, and he agrees a date to engage the Muslims in battle in the year 732, in a very famous battle called the Battle of Tours. Tours. Tours is in France. This is mid-France. So what happens in this Battle of Tours? This is the most decisive battle the Muslims will have with the French in France. In Tours. Okay, so what happens? Now, it's winter. It's like October, November time. It's cold in France. And the Muslims, when they go there, Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi's army, they don't know where Charles Martel has arranged the battle. They don't know the location. Charles Martel had been preparing for the Muslims since 721. Now it's 732. So he's had a long time to look and consider the Muslims. He knows who they are. He knows the way that they fight. He knows the armament that they have. He knows the weapons that they have. And so what he does is he chooses the location of the battle. Okay, it's on a hill. So the Muslims have a very strong cavalry. He has a very strong infantry, men, foot soldiers, And so the horses, of course, would struggle to come uphill, just like the problem we had before with the mountains of Asturias. They would struggle to go uphill. He arranges his army on the top of the hill, under the cover of trees. So the Muslims, Uthmaan Ghafiqi and his army, they're there, with the horses, they're looking up, and that's where Charles Martel's army is, but under the cover of the trees, so they can't see exactly where they are. It's like a hidden army. Second thing is, when Charles Martel approached the battle scene, he took the small roads, not the big roads, the small roads under cover of darkness, so they couldn't see what route they would take to their battle site. Okay, the second thing. Number 3, they were prepared for the winter. So this is, of course, they live there, so they know, of course, their own terrain. Prepared for the winter, they had good clothing, they could last the siege. But the Muslims, they're struggling because they don't have the right clothes, right? They're wearing jubbahs, and stuff, because they can't. It's very cold. So how do you deal with a situation like that? This is very cold, and 1 day is 2 days, 3 days, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days, and it's too long. Now they have to make a move. They have to break that deadlock, and so Uthmaan Ghafiqi says, let's just march upwards. And they marched upwards. Now, Charles Martel, he arranges his battle, his army, in what's called a flanks. Flanks, P-H-L-A-N-X, flanks. Flanks is a Greek military kind of, a battlement. Okay, so what it's made of is made like a rectangular mass, all of infantry. A rectangular mass of infantry. And they didn't have many, cavalry of horsemen, and so the idea is therefore that there's always reinforcements in the phalanx. When the Muslims marched upwards into to get to the top, where they are, the men just marched downwards, and the horses, of course, struggled to come upwards, and so they were really outmaneuvered by the Christians. It was a very decisive victory for Charles Martel. And he was really lauded, by the Christian world as Charles Martellus, Charles the Hammer, they called him, Charles Prince of the Franks, they called him, and the Christians really made use of this defeat in their chronicles. They depicted it as a defeat against Islam and the Muslims, and that is the furthest point Muslims would ever get in France. Never ever until today they got further than the Battle of Tours, that location. That's been the final point in terms of conquest. So they tried Bordeaux, Aquitaine, and Toulouse, but not further than Tours, and this is 732. Anyway, Muslims, of course, this is now we're dealing with. That's the first things the Muslims of Al-Andalus did in the 700s. They're just working on consolidating their rule. They're building their army strong. They have a sequence of governors, and this is one thing again. So in hindsight, historians, they say there might have been a bit of an error because they have a quick succession of governors. So as soon as they capture a place, they appoint a governor, and then within 6, 7 months, 8 months, they appoint a new governor, and it's too many governors. So they can't therefore stabilize their rule because it's just a sequence of quick successions of governors. But they're doing good things, and so the first capital for the Muslims of Al-Andalus was Seville, Ishbiliya. Not for long until it moved to Cordoba. Now, if you think about it, Seville is an amazing, beautiful place. It's a really beautiful place, and you can think about why the Muslims chose that as a location for their first capital. It's really, really stunningly beautiful. And remember that Muslims, when they went there, they'd never seen something so beautiful. It's not like they were used to the terrain of the Arab world. Sometimes it's almost recurring, isn't it? Like, looks the same. But when they saw Spain, I mean, it's wow, what on earth is that? It was really stunning. And the weather, Allahu Akbar, the climate, the weather, the trees, the calm, the peace, it was really beautiful. And they fell in love with it. Now here Allah in the Quran gives us something to think about. Allah in the Quran says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا جعلنا ما على الأرض زينة لها لنبلوهم أيهم أحسن عملا. We have made on the earth something beautiful, adornment, زينة لها, adornment in the earth. لنبلوهم أيهم أحسن عملا. So we could test which of them are best in action. So if Allah gave them this land, what are they going to do in that land? They could corrupt it, they could ruin it, they could be tyrannical. or they could deal with the people with justice and goodness. And Allah in the Quran says, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ, Allah says, we made you, after them, خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ مِنْ بَعْدِهِمْ لِنَنْظُرْ كَيْفَ تَعْمَلُونَ. We made you خَلَائِفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ, rulers, successors on the land, so we could see not just ماذا تعملون, what do you do, كيف تعملون, how do you do. This is كيفية العمل. This is the how of action. How do you act? Right? If you say we're going to establish justice, how would you do that? With what principle? With what mercy? With what goodness would you deal with the people? And so, in that early period, remember it's hard because we're dealing with 800 years of rule, so we can't. You have to go be a bit fast. But the point is, it's for the first, let's say, few centuries, Muslims are consolidating their rule. Something big happens. Something big happens. Again, we're still in the 8th century, so 700. So now, 732 Battle of Tours. What happens in 750? Something very big happens. In 750, you had the Abbasid revolution. And so the Umayyad Khilafah was based in Damascus. The Abbasids had a revolt. They killed the members of the Umayyad family. The leading members, they just slaughtered, they killed them. All of them. And they took power. Then you had the beginning of the Abbasid Khilafah. But there was one boy, who was 20 years old, 19, 20 years old, who survived. So they were all killed, mother, father, uncles, all killed. This one boy survived. His name was Uthmaan. They called him Saqr Quraysh, the Falcon of Quraysh. And he fled together with his brother and his son and his two sisters. His brother, his son, his two sisters. They fled. They fled together. And the plan was to follow the Euphrates River. They're fleeing from the Abbasids. Now, Uthmaan, he's a Berber, so he has like orangish hair, so easily recognizable. And so the Abbasids sent mercenaries out to try and track him, find him. And the whole plan is just to follow the Euphrates River. It reminds me, in fact, of like Harriet Tubman, the amazing, remarkable woman, Harriet Tubman, who helped in the freeing of so many slaves in America, when they were enslaved by white slave owners. And she had this, and she was the head of the Underground Railway movement in America. Harriet Tubman, a remarkable woman. And the whole plan was follow the Northern Star, because that led to Chicago, a safe zone. Whereas down south in Mississippi, it was a more of a racist area. Reminds you of that. Or even like in Australia, you have an amazing story of there's two girls who had to escape following the rabbit-proof fence. These were Aboriginal girls, right? Aboriginal girls, and they were separated from their parents, and they were by themselves taken to like a boarding school where they were bullied and everything else. And the grandmother reminded them that always remember to follow the rabbit-proof fence, and that would lead to home. And these two or three young girls, they walked hundreds and hundreds of miles by themselves, following the rabbit-proof fence until they got home. I think one died on the way, But it's something similar. So therefore, his idea was follow the Euphrates River, going from Damascus, Palestine, Sinai, until they get to Egypt. But they followed. And so Uthmaan and his brother once caught up, the mercenaries catch up with them, and so they kind of throw themselves in the Euphrates River, and they try to swim to safety. But his brother couldn't swim too well, and so he swims back to shore. The Abbasid mercenaries are waiting for them, and they kill him, they slaughter him, they decapitate him. And his brother witnessed. Uthmaan saw that happening. He was supposed to frighten him, but he has no choice except to carry on going, and so he carries on going. Now he has a slave with him, a Berber slave called Badr, slave or ex-slave with him. And so these two go. He leaves his sisters behind in a caravan because they're less likely to be harmed, and they get to Egypt. Now in Egypt there is a Berber, there's an Abbasid governor, newly appointed, who used to be Umayyad loyalist, but now he's Berber supporter. Sorry, he's Abbasid supporter. And he sent his mercenaries to try and find these two, Abdurrahman and his servant, and they escape him, and they arrive in the Maghrib, in Morocco, Maghrib, in the year 755. This is 5 years. It took them 5 years since Abbasid revolution to get to the Maghrib. Now, the great bulk of Muslims in Al-Andalus are Syrians. They were part of the original army, and so Syrians, that's where the Umayyad Khilafah was. You had the Umayyad dynasty based in Damascus. May Allah help the Muslims of Syria, of Bilad al-Sham. But that's where they were. And so what he does is he sends his servant Badr to go to Damascus and find out, like a reconnaissance mission, will they accept him if he comes into Al-Andalus? Would they accept him? And so he goes there and he says, it's good ground for you because they're waiting for someone like you to lead them. He's only like 25 now. And so when he goes there, crosses, they welcome him and they appoint him, and he becomes the Umayyad ruler. They appoint him as the Umayyad ruler. So now it's a bit odd because you have the Abbasid Khilafah dynasty, you have the birth now of the Umayyad Khilafah, and then you have another one which is the Fatimid Shia. They have their own Khalif. So you have these three kind of power bases at the same time. But he does a beautiful thing, Abdurrahman, because he deals with the people with justice, and they love him because he's from them. He's from them. But the most important ruler was not Abdurrahman, the first Aqr Quraysh. It was in fact Abdurrahman the third. He was the most celebrated Muslim ruler. He was the Khalif, as well appointed Khalif, and he really transformed Al-Andalus. At that time, he really gave it the shape that it had, the face that it had. Abdurrahman III worked with Jewish people as well as Christians. He made, in that time, what came to be known as convivencia, which is the coexistence of Muslim Jews and Christians together, building this amazing civilization. He had a Jewish diplomat called Hasdai ibn Shaprut. He would send him to major centers like Constantinople, Rome, to bring them in and see the splendor of Al-Andalus. What was happening in Al-Andalus? The Muslims, this is Abdurrahman III's great idea and great thinking. One of the first things he did was he reduced the taxes upon the people. Reduced the taxes. And so therefore he dealt with them with a lot of mercy, with a lot of kindness and goodness, and they really began to love him. He sought to do away with divisions, right? So one thing that you had in Al-Andalus is because you had Muslims who settled in different areas. Like, for example, you had Syrians in one area, and then you had the Turks, and then you had the Berbers, and you had different people, different areas. And so over time, resentment would breed, hostility against others would breed, and this is a problem that happened, right? If you're only living amongst your own people, all you see is your own people, and you can't connect with other people because you think everything is in this one area. And they began to think like that. And so he did away with that, and he made a new army of about 15,000 Muslims in his army. So rather than having independent rulers think about one single rule, he did that. Cordoba was the capital of Al-Andalus, so Seville for a short time, and then Cordoba was the main city. And Cordoba became known as the City of Lights. Why is it a City of Lights? Cordoba was the first lighted lamped city. 10,000 lamps in the city of Cordoba. Lights, right? So this is street lamps, street lights. Just imagine. Everything else there's nothing like that anywhere in the European world. So Cordoba, you had street lamps, 10,000 of them. In that one city, you had 300 libraries. 300 libraries in one city. 600 masajid. 600 mosques in one city. 50 hospitals in Cordoba. Abdurrahman III, the Khalif, has a personal library of 300,000 books. Imagine. And we have 30, we think, oh, 300,000, 3,000, wow. And he's a Khalif. And this is personal library, not for public use. 300,000 books. That shows he must be quite clever. He's reading. He's reading and he's learning. So the idea was putting the emphasis on learning. He sets up makatib for blind students, makatib for disabled students, schools, right? You know what was the madhab that was in Spain was the Maliki madhab. Maliki. Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi was the Maliki Imam of Al-Andalus. He studied the Muwatta at the feet of Imam Malik himself. Imagine. Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi is a very famous story. He goes all the way from Al-Andalus to Medina to study the Muwatta with Imam Malik. Right? It's a very famous incident what happened once in Medina. He's studying the hadith with him, and all of a sudden in the class, all of the young boys, they get up and they run out because an elephant had come. Okay, there was an elephant. Okay, and so for them it was an attraction to see an elephant. Except Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, he remained in his position. So Imam Malik asked him and he says, "Why didn't you go?" I said, "The elephant." He said, I left Al-Andalus. I came all the way from here not to see an elephant. I came to see you. And it's very beautiful. So he came back, therefore he became the main source of reference and knowledge of the Muslims in Al-Andalus, and that was the Maliki method was the predominant one in Al-Andalus. And so if you imagine for Muslim schools, they made beautiful homes and houses, irrigation. Seville became known as the land of boating and agriculture. From Seville you had Abu al-Khair. Abu al-Khair authored his Kitab al-Falaha, the book of farming. Ibn al-Awwam al-Ishbili, he wrote a book describing more than 568 types of plants. If I said to you, let's name a plant each, I don't think we'll get anything. You'll just say the same one as him, and I'll say the same one as you. Imagine 568 types of different plants. You see, in his book. These people were geniuses. I mean, they were scholars in their own fields. Abu al-Khair, the other one. In Seville, Allah Akbar, you had women, Valada. Valada, she was a Almohid princess, and she was a grammarian. And she worked on manuscript illumination. She was a poetess, Valada. You had so many others like her. You had great people working in those lands, but that was really the main center of boating. In Qurtuba, for example, you had science. Ibn Zuhr, Ibn Zawar, very celebrated as the master of surgery. Az-Zahrawi, the master of surgery, of science. You had Ibn Sina, again, philosophy, science, the work on ethics, for example. Ibn Rushd, Ibn Zawar, everyone knows Ibn Rushd. These were from Al-Andalus. Imam al-Qurtubi, the Imam of Qurtuba, Al-Qurtubi was from Qurtuba. Great scholars are emerging, scientists, luminaries. Muhammad ibn Fatuh was the man who made the astrolabe. This is Seville, I think, Seville or Qurtuba, in that land. And so all these great personalities, Muslims are emerging, spending time writing. Great scholars passed through. Travelers, Ibn Battuta passed through. At the same time in Baghdad, what's happening is you have the Dar al-Hikmah. Dar al-Hikmah is another place that's a land of wisdom, that's a place of learning. So you had Al-Khawarizmi. Al-Khawarizmi, where you get algorithms from, isn't it? Algorithms are named after him. In Al-Andalus, also from him is algebra, because of his book, Kitab al-Jabr, isn't it? The book of... So algebra, therefore, is from him, from Al-Khawarizmi. And they took that. And so what's happening, therefore, is that when the Muslims are creating all these amazing things in the Western world, they don't have anything. No focus on sciences, or not as much as what the Muslims have. And so you have Westerners who are now traveling all the way to Al-Andalus, and they're learning from the Muslims. Famous names like Petrus Alfonsi. Petrus Alfonsi was the one who was a Jew, a Christian who became a Jew who became Christian in 1118. And then he traveled northwards. He went to England. He became the surgeon, I think, for King Henry. And he introduced to the Western world what the Muslims are learning of science, of mathematics, right, of art, and all these things. Petrus Alfonsi. Michael Scott was the one, I think, who translated the astronomical tables of Al-Khawarizmi, right? You had Michael Scott, Adelard of Bath, very famous Adelard of Bath, right? He learned Arabic, translated the works of Muslim scientists into Hebrew, Castilian, Arabic, right? Latin, translated them for the Western people to learn. This is what the Muslims, and then they built on it. And then the Westerners, then they built on it. And they began to investigate more. So the Muslims, therefore, for this period, are really focused on learning and building a civilization. Abdurrahman III builds a new city called Madinatul Zahra. Madinatul Zahra. And he builds this city from scratch in 1 year, an entire new city. And this whole city was therefore to show the Western world, that would bring in these diplomats and dignitaries to see the splendor of Al-Andalus, a new city just for the purpose of pomp. It's quite sad, actually, to be honest with you. It's quite a sad thing, because one thing that you notice happening, therefore, is that although a lot of achievements are being made and a lot of things are happening, there's something you can notice. Of course, you read history in hindsight, and historians reflect back on it, and they say, well, what was it? Where were things going wrong? Well, at one point, you run the risk of turning the elegance into excess, elegance into extravagance. You know, who's heard of Masjid Qurtuba, the masjid in Qurtuba? At that time, it was the most grand mosque in the world, Masjid Qurtuba. You know, built in 1 year, year 786. You know, the most grand mosque. You know, it has arches and archways, and it's just symmetrical. It's just so outstandingly beautiful. Right now, it's a chapel. Now you can't pray anything in there, but it looks like a mosque. Everything is still there as a mosque. All the inscriptions, many of them are still there, but there's also a chapel inside it. Muhammad, what's his name? What's the famous Urdu poet's name? What's his name? Muhammad Iqbal. Sorry, yeah. He went there. He prayed there in 1933. He was allowed to pray there, and he wrote a very long poem called Masjid Qurtuba. One of his lines, he says, "Didai anjame teri zameen asmana ke sadio soteri fazabi azan." He says, you know, it's a long. It's only one I learned. It's just that one line. It's a very long poem, so don't look too impressed, because that's all I know of the entire poem. You know. But he says, you know, like he says, your earth is like heaven. You know, your earth is like heaven. But it's a shame no one can even call adhan in you today. You know, and so they're very strict. You know, you can't do anything there because now it's a chapel. You know,